What if I told you that the flood of Chinese EVs into the Western world all started around 40 years ago by two prominent politicians from the US and UK who unleashed a tidal wave of policies which has now led to a flood of very good EVs coming to market and challenging the legacy automakers.
I was recently at the Shanghai Auto Show in 2023 and there were a lot of very nervous looking German and Japanese executives. So where did it all start? Let's strap in and go for a ride.
Let's rewind the clock back to September 1982. Margaret Thatcher, the UK Prime Minister, visits China to try and negotiate the lease for Hong Kong, set to run out in 1997. This is where she met Deng Xiaoping, the leader in China, responsible for opening up and massive market reforms. And after a tense few hours, she left frustrated and then fell to her knees. A symbolic moment for the decline of British globalisation and the upcoming surge of China.
So both Thatcher's government and Reagan's government thought that by outsourcing labour-intensive jobs to another country with lower production costs meant that they could focus their own economies on a more service-based model.
China, with its vast labour force and growing manufacturing capabilities, became an attractive destination for offshoring. The country offered competitive advantages, including lower labour costs and less stringent regulations, making it super appealing to cut production costs and maximise profits. Those are the two most important words here. Now, what was the 1980s famous for again? Ah yes, disgustingly large profits. A worker who earned $20 in the US could be replaced by a worker in China or elsewhere for $1 to $2 per hour, meaning that $19 went on importing, which was pennies really, and the rest went in someone's pocket. But employment of operators, fabricators and labourers fell from 20 million to 16.8 million, a decline of 15.9%. Meanwhile, traditional manufacturing sectors faced challenges as jobs were lost or shifted overseas. Mines closed, manufacturing jobs went out of the window. Unemployment in the UK was 3 million in the early 1980s. But it wasn't just jobs moving to China, it was companies and complete supply chains. And it all started very subtly. The US started to manufacture Jeeps in Beijing, called the Beijing Jeep, in 1984. This was a collaboration between BAIC and AMC. Beijing would provide the land, the people, and America would provide the cars and the technology. The Germans did the same with VW in Shanghai, producing locally made Santanas, which surprisingly only stopped production in 2016. Those yuppie executives and Western government officials thought fine, China really only knows how to do fairly basic manufacturing. It's going to stay that way for a very long time. And this is a mindset that really held until this year for some people.
Whilst the executives continued having their pockets stuffed full of cash, they kept their eyes firmly closed to what was happening in China. China was clearly emerging as the factory of the world as more and more offshoring went there. In fact, China's economy grew by 10% year on year for 29 years. Rather incredible. But what they were doing was actually they were training their own citizens. They were training the engineers, the designers, because the Chinese had a strategy and they had a plan, a very long-term plan.
This is not just a UK and US phenomenon though. Although in the UK we had Thatcherism and in the US Reaganomics, in Japan, where cars had absolutely boomed in popularity globally, they were enjoying the Japanese economic miracle. The nation experienced rapid industrialization and became a leader in manufacturing and technology. Japanese companies such as Toyota and Sony revolutionized their industries, producing high quality products that gained worldwide acclaim. Honda and Toyota all formed joint ventures with Chinese automakers in Guangzhou to build cars in the market and absolutely dominate auto sales in China for years. The economic boom in these countries had a profound impact on the global economy. GDP growth rates soared, unemployment levels dropped and living standards improved. This era witnessed the rise of iconic brands, the development of financial markets, and the integration of technology into everyday life. Everything was going fine, right?
But whilst this was all happening, there were some small, very small voices who were shouting loudly. The first said that if we continue on this path, China will dominate manufacturing forevermore. But the executive said, don't worry about that because I've just bought another yacht, so I don't really care. The second was that the environment was going to suffer. So the smart-minded people in California, the California Air Resource Board, CARB, came up with the Clean Air Act in 1990. And they said, there's another way. Why don't we make electric vehicles?
Air pollution problems has set a standard that requires that 2% of all vehicles offered for sale in 1998 have to be zero-emission vehicles or electric cars.
But what they brought out was a few tokenistic EVs. They even spurred on the Japanese automakers to bring some. Have you heard of the GM EV1? Probably. Have you heard of the Selectria Force? Maybe not. The RAV4 EV? Probably not. But they only sold 5,000. But this was a really good signal to China. They thought, they've given up on EVs. This is an area that we could specialise in.
Quietly from the sidelines, China looked on and an idea was formulating. They wanted a car industry, but how? Basically in 2 steps. Form foreign joint ventures to learn and then dominate in a sector untouched. The early 2000s marked a significant turning point for China's economy. With its vast population and immense potential, China embarked on a path of economic reform and liberalisation, paving the way for accelerated growth. Market-orientated reforms, increased foreign investment, and a focus on export-led manufacturing were among some of the key drivers behind China's economic success. But how could they catch up? Well, the first step was the joint ventures. Any automaker who wanted to sell in China needed to form a joint venture with a local brand. AMC with BAIC or VW with SAIC were 2 early examples. But how could Chinese automotive companies compete with Legacy Auto, who had years of development, expert engineers in the field of producing and making cars? Well, they pivoted to electric.
And this, my friends, in 2015 is where the Made in China 2025 policy came about. This came about to spur on innovation, growth in technology and research and development, but in a green and sustainable way. That's how we've been developing into this green ecosystem that we see here behind me in Shanghai on this very, very wet day.
Made in China 2025 was around developing innovation and moving away from the manufacture of low-end technology to high-end technology, and developing domestic industries whilst reducing reliance on foreign technology. Of course, a huge part of this was the development of the domestic car industry, and the only way they could do that was by going the EV route, in which legacy automakers, other than Tesla, who's not legacy really, had almost completely abandoned. In 2015, there was only a handful of EVs in the country. One of the most notable ones was the BYD E6, also used as the Shenzhen taxi to this day.
Support of the government, Chinese companies invested in R&D and innovation to bring up their engineering, hardware and software standards. Companies such as XPeng and NIO heavily invested in tech, and look at where they are now. It wasn't just car companies though, it was battery companies. CATL, originally started in '99 but properly founded in 2011, had a huge amount of innovation and R&D development for them, which led them to where they are today. Now if we rewind to 2019, just before COVID, there were really only a handful of EV models on the market. One from NIO, one from XPeng, one or 2 from Roway, the Rover brand.
Then COVID hit and borders closed.
And with the country effectively closed off for 3 years, there was a complete explosion of EVs in the market. And with that, battery companies also grew massively, CATL being one of the biggest. And those executives who once scoffed and laughed in Europe are now looking at the ships landing on their shores full of Chinese EVs. Can you believe that in 1985, China produced just 5,000 cars? Fast forward to 2022, China produced 11,900,000 cars.
Leap Motor sold 1,000 cars in 2019. they sold 112,000 in 2022. Neo sold 20,000 in 2019. They sold 122,000 in 2022. Xpeng sold 17,000 in 2019. They sold 120,000 in 2022. And the list goes on and on and on. That's why the Shanghai Auto Show in 2023 will go down as the significant moment in history, when executives realised that all of that offshoring was now going to come back and bite them in the arse. And the cherry on top of the cake? In May 2023, China exceeded car exports more than Japan for the first time ever in history. The tipping point for Chinese manufacturing has come, and the dominance of the West in automotive is coming to an end. The entry of Chinese EV makers into international markets has also acted as a catalyst for innovation and competition amongst legacy automakers. Recognising the changing landscape and consumer demand, traditional automakers have accelerated their own EV development and launched competitive models to try and stay relevant in this very rapidly evolving market. But the question is it too little, too late?
And now you can see how Ronald and Margaret set off a chain of events that changed the world forever. Of course, I'm just tickling the surface. There's many other factors which come into play here, but hopefully it's given you a really good insight into how Made in China 2025 has led to the green EV landscape that we see today.